Hey, this is Zen Zenith just sneaking in to say check out the House Show with Zen Zenith. That's me on Dragon Wagon Radio. The House Show is a live concert series featuring stripped-down performances and interviews with amazing singer-songwriters. We do the whole thing in front of a real live audience at a real live house and package the whole thing up into a podcast for you to experience in the ease of your home or car. Real intimate performances, real intimate conversations with great people. Check it out at thehouseshowshow.com or on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else good podcasts are found. We'll see you there.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Steven Sabel.
Welcome back, my fellow Quillers. Here we are with another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, brought to you proudly by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Don't forget, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. And if you haven't spent a little time perusing around the website, you need to do that. ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. That's ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. Go explore and learn a few more things about this wonderfully intriguing topic. Today's episode, we want to introduce to the program a member of the Board of Trustees of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Also,
for about another month, yeah.
Yeah, there he is. Also, former theater, English, and political science professor with an undergraduate degree from Duke's, and including a master's degree in Shakespeare authorship studies. His name is Walter Hurst, and he is going to talk to us today about a book that he is writing about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's influence on the World Wars I and II. It's called Shakespeare and the World Wars, Legacy, Identity, Influence, and Cultural Appropriation by Walter K. Hurst. Wally, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. It's an honor to be with you.
Tell me, I know that you've done a lot, with that background of being a theater teacher / usually theater teachers are one-man production teams at the institutions that they work for. So true. Producer, director, technical, designer, et cetera, then English and English literature professor, then political science on top of that. That makes you so extremely qualified to address this topic that you're going to be talking about in your book. But I happen to have a little bit of inside information because I did see your presentation that you gave at one of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship annual conferences where you talked about specifically, I believe in that particular presentation, Shakespeare's influence on the Third Reich of Germany.
Oh, it's a huge topic, and you can get lost in the research. I keep going down rabbit holes, and I go, wow, isn't that interesting? And you have to come back up and go, focus on what you're doing, Wally. And it's really a great topic because you have all these people throughout German politics and German literature and the German intelligentsia and commentators on all of those things throughout the history of Germany, and you start thinking, "Wow, that is a really interesting topic." But for me, it's a subtopic, and I've got to, get back to what I got to do. It is really interesting because Shakespeare. How many people have written books on Shakespeare politics? Some of them who know what they're talking about, and some of them just quote Shakespeare and say, "Well, he means this," and not really.
Okay, that's good to know.
But the history of it, especially in Germany, as you know, you saw the presentation. Shakespeare took a country with, what was it, 300 different political affiliations in Germany in the 1800s, and through his influence and the influence of a huge number of intellectuals, including Goethe and Gundolf and dozens of others. molded it through literature a great deal into one country and one people and one nation, and that was I think a fairly good thing, except for they chose their leaders badly. But there
so we're
was
talking about leading up to World War One. With the Kaiser and
Correct.
the advance of World War One. So this long predates Hitler's Third Reich. This obsession with Shakespeare among the German, as you said, intelligentsia. I love that term.
I do too. It's a fun and it predates all of that. The German celebration of Shakespeare's tercentenary in 1914 was bigger in Germany than it was in England. The keynote address for the English one was given by a German professor, Alois Brandl, and they took credit for Shakespeare. In fact, one of the terms of surrender for the Germans was going to be if they won, that England had to give them Shakespeare.
I remember there being an aspect of your presentation, and I'm pretty sure that presentation is available at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship YouTube website as well. So if our listeners would like to go learn some more after they hear this program, they can go to the YouTube channel and they can find that presentation there. But I want to say one of the things that I remember the entire room at that conference laughing about was when you talked about how there were members of the German, let's call them aristocracy at this point, who were claiming Shakespeare as their own. So they were, in a sense, Shakespeare authorship doubters themselves, in that they were like, no, this guy can't be who they say he is. He's too smart for that. He's too learned for that. He has way too much intelligence and way too much experience. He must have been German.
And there is, why else was he sent? Why else was Hamlet sent to Wittenberg, for God's sake? I mean, so he could get smarter. There is a huge amount of, there's, what is it at that time, and even today there are more productions of Shakespeare in Germany than there are in any one time in England. And at that time, in the early 1900s, certainly in 1914, I believe the figure was around 10 times more productions in Germany of Shakespeare than there were in England. He is studied, and as you know, all of the best scholarship on Shakespeare that is not in English is in German.
Absolutely true.
They have studied him. They have done a whole great deal of things with him, and of course, the one German even wrote a poem of praise to him, saying, Germany is Hamlet.
There's a couple of really good, solid documentaries you can find too if you do a little search. If you can get through the subtitles of some German scholars who present some wonderful evidence and some wonderful research about Shakespeare. So I would encourage our listeners, if they really want to dive deep into this, they can also look those up. And if any of our listeners are actually fluent in German, they'll love it.
Oh, they will love it. And there is a fairly good number of English examinations of aspects of this particular. My favorite book probably on the German side of things is Andres Hoffele's No Hamlets, German Shakespeare from Nietzsche to Carl Schmitt, and that is a fantastic book. Just No Hamlets that's good. He quotes Hamlet. He quotes the poem at the beginning of the book, and there are several of those. I have some of those quotes if you want, but the best one, of course, it does say Deutschland is Hamlet. Solemn, slow, within its gates walks every night, pale buried freedom to and fro, and fills the watchers with affright. But the biggest one I thought was, and I talked about him in my presentation, Stefan George, who was German intelligentsia of the highest order, had a number of his disciples, including, I found out, about 6 weeks ago, and almost dived off the cliff into a rabbit hole for this. One of his biggest disciples was a man named Klaus von Stauffenberg. Klaus? Yes, Klaus. I believe it's Klaus. The guy who tried to assassinate Hitler.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Now, see, I think that's fascinating. So that's very interesting
But
because
that's
here
a
you
rabbit hole I
have
can't go down. So somebody else do that.
here's Hitler, who is Shakespeare belongs to Germany, but
Right.
but Hitler and of course the Third Reich were known for appropriating everything and anything that
Of
they
course.
felt like they wanted to, from
Of course.
art
I mean, he was
to literature to you name it.
correct.
But also, ironically, on the opposing side is a man who is equally obsessed with Shakespeare, who tries to assassinate Hitler. And that is reminiscent of, to me, the 1860s, where you have a president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who is absolutely obsessed with Shakespeare and would often hold his cabinet members hostage to make them listen to him recite passages from the plays. But then you also have his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, a member of the famous Booth family of actors, who his older brother, Junius Brutus Booth, is named after Marcus Junius Brutus because of his father's obsession with the play Julius Caesar, which ends up leading to the assassination of Lincoln.
Correct. And
This
what we
writer-
always say, Stephen, Shakespeare is such a non-entity in himself that people read him and see themselves. So Shakespeare is great for leaders. According to leaders, Shakespeare is great for people who overthrow tyrants, according to John Wilkes Booth.
Okay, but the premise of your coming book, so obviously Shakespeare has been an influence on so many people, from heads of state to would-be assassins and everyone in between.
Correct.
For 400 years. But the premise of your book also includes information about how Shakespeare influenced other nations involved in these major world conflicts. So I would assume that would include Mussolini,
Yep.
and perhaps the Japanese Empire.
Of course.
Share with us a little bit of insight into how he played a role with these other leaders of these other nations.
Okay, we'll start with Mussolini, since we were just talking about Julius Caesar.
Great.
Mussolini believed, and of course, as you know, in all of these countries during the war, the enemy playwrights were not allowed to be produced except for Shakespeare. And in Germany and Italy's case, also George Bernard Shaw, who they believed, being Irish, hated the English even more than they did. So they allowed Shaw and Shakespeare to be produced on their stages. But Mussolini in Italy decided that Italian school children, and there's a different path to get to Italy and Shakespeare than there is Germany and Shakespeare. Italy was a little bit later and a little bit hit and miss as far as translations and circulation goes. But Mussolini believed that Shakespeare needed to be mandatory in all Italian schools as of 1933. Himself adapted and produced a production of Julius Caesar in Rome in 1935, I think it was. Yes, 1935.
I love that Italian audacity.
Oh yes, it was quite a spectacle, according to everyone who was there, and they invited everybody. Of course, it was free. It was put on in a huge plaza in Rome, and it was just a very much a spectacular production. They pulled out all the stops, and Mussolini saw himself as Caesar. And that was not a bad thing as far as fascist politics, fascism was concerned, except for, of course, he didn't want anybody to kill him. So basically, it was Julius Caesar's first act. The first half of the show before he gets killed. And personally, I think it takes a turn for the worse as far as Shakespeare goes after that anyway. But anyway, after the funeral scene. But Shakespeare to Mussolini was the epitome of duty to country and honor over all. And so Mussolini took that to mean that Shakespeare saw the glory of Julius Caesar by making him a sympathetic character, by making him a brilliant example of Italian greatness. And so by putting on that play and by making sure everybody knew about Shakespeare and the plays that Mussolini wanted them to know about, that Shakespeare had obviously blessed this fascist republic, and that's how it worked in Italy. It's really stunning. And the same thing in Germany. You would think that they would have produced Merchant of Venice 1,000 times in Nazi Germany because of the Jewish emphasis on that play. And they did do it a bunch, but people got tired of it after a while, I think. They did more Midsummer Night's Dream, more Twelfth Night. And it's really a fascinating, another rabbit hole that I can't dive into too deeply because I have all the playlists from all the German play theaters in from the 30s and 40s. So it's really a fascinating thing to think. You would think that Merchant of Venice would be done ad nauseum, right? Well, it was not. Shakespeare, and I would have thought, except for the problem of England conquering, England being the enemy, I would have thought Henry V would have been a great play for them all to do because everybody conquers France, you know. But it didn't happen that way. And for Japan, I went off the deep end there for a while.
That's okay. But before you move on to
yes,
Emperor Hirohito and Japan, what I'm sitting here stunned at my own reaction is how much I find myself in agreement with Mussolini on something.
Oh, yes.
And that being that there was this glorification of totalitarianism.
Correct.
And I believe that is absolutely true in Shakespeare. And
it
who
is.
was one of the greatest totalitarian rulers of all history, but Elizabeth I.
That is correct. Yeah, everybody, and we talk to people, as you and I both do, Steve, and we say, Shakespeare did not live in a time of glorious literary or political freedom. North Korea would be a paradise of rights compared to Elizabethan England. They just don't get it, and you had to have some privilege in order to be able to write as Shakespeare did, I believe.
I think you had to have the most extreme privilege in order to write as Shakespeare did.
I agree. I think he was an aristocrat, no question about it. Heavily aristocratic, and I'm no aristocrat. I'm a middle class guy, and it's such an amazing thing to me for people not to see that. But like I said, Shakespeare is such a blank slate biographically that you can think anything you want, and he'll fit into that because there's so much blank slate to work with.
Well, apparently Hitler and Mussolini had no problem with shaping him to their mold. Tell us about how the Empire of the Sun shaped Shakespeare to their mold.
This is the most fascinating thing because the more you read about it, Shakespeare represented the enemy, and yet his philosophy represented something to strive for. Japan, as you know, was very, very isolated until the mid 19th century. But after that, Shakespeare and English became very, very much in vogue there. They have a great deal of willingness to learn, eagerness to learn. Not quite obsessive yet, but fairly close. They have a great deal of insight into Shakespeare. There's a cartoon, I believe I showed this during the presentation of. There's a picture of Japan's Secretary of State from the 1930s in a cartoon fashion. You can recognize him in a Tokyo newspaper, and there is a caption underneath it in English and Japanese that says to be or not to be. And there is, it's really fascinating. It is the enemy that we must pattern ourselves after. And again, there wasn't a whole lot of theater in Japan after World War I started, of course. World War II started, of course. But up until then, he was the horrible enemy that we must emulate. And it's just it must have been very difficult for people like the Emperor and Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who just loved Shakespeare, to say, okay, he's an enemy playwright, but you can go ahead and produce him if you want, you know?
But he's a staunch imperialist.
He is a staunch imperialist.
He
is a person who is in favor of totalitarian rule. Absolutely.
Yes, and kings and queens are ordained by God.
Yes.
They are anointed rulers. And you could see how some of these men would cleave to that.
And then the beginning of the Third Reich, the beginning of Mussolini's Italy. I'm not sure about the beginning of Tojo's reign or the Emperor's reign in Japan, but I know at the beginning of both Germany and Italy's rulers, Hitler and Mussolini, they had meetings with the arts folks, the theater folks, and said, you must produce more classics, more Shakespeare, more of these particular fantastic plays. And they mentioned Shakespeare by name. Both of them did. And you think to yourself, what the heck's going on here? But it's true.
Well, the one thing that you have to, regardless of, like, you look at men like Mussolini, Hitler, Tojo, Hirohito, you look at these men and you have to, regardless of the way they practiced their brilliance, you have to acknowledge their brilliance.
Oh, yes.
You have to acknowledge that these were extremely intelligent men.
Yeah.
Egomaniacal, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Overly ambitious like Caesar, absolutely.
Sure.
But still super smart.
And certainly Mussolini and indeed Hitler, as you know, fancied themselves as what? Artists.
Yes, absolutely.
Hitler was going to design buildings.
I'm pretty sure some of his paintings are still worth millions of dollars.
Correct.
Right?
And Mussolini was basically a co-director of Julius Caesar, and wrote and rewrote and adapted and did all sorts of things to the play.
Oh, that must have been a spectacular production with all the power and resources of the state government behind it.
Oh, I know. And it's funny. And of course, as you know, Germany also funded their theaters, which is one reason why they had so much control over them.
Sure.
But that is important to note that in the beginning, both Germany and Italy not only encouraged, but strongly encouraged the productions of Shakespeare by local, regional theaters.
You mentioned just briefly a moment ago, you mentioned North Korea, and you said that would be a paradise for writers compared to Elizabethan England. And the amount of censorship. And, people talk about Kim Jong-un, and the bottom line is that man has experienced one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive education any human being can purchase on the planet.
Yes, he has.
He was educated in Switzerland at an exorbitant fee.
Oh, yeah.
Where they turn a blind eye to whomever is paying the bill.
It's all about the tuition money, baby.
Name. Yeah, under an assumed name, because they had no idea he was actually the son of a North Korean dictator.
No.
And he received the most expensive education you can possibly get. He's not a dummy.
No, he's not. He's crazy as a, In fact, in my political science class, I believe I did call him Kim Jong crazy person, but he is highly educated. He understands the classics. And I imagine at heart, in his heart of hearts, he too fancies himself as an artist.
I don't know about that. I don't know enough details about him as far as his later life, but I know enough about his early life to know that he and his siblings were educated in Switzerland and received that magnificent, highly expensive, highly exclusive education, along with the sons and daughters of other rulers of the world.
Correct. Aristocratic rulers born to lead. In his case, I would use the phrase pearls before swine, but I'd be
curious to know what he thinks about Shakespeare.
I'm not sure. Not sure. I wonder if he takes questions from the audience.
But the point being is that these men that we've been talking about cleaved to this writer because they saw in him a level of genius, a level of brilliance, a level of loyalty to the totalitarian state.
Correct.
And as you know, the empire of his time.
Correct. And as you know, Shakespeare's politics and his political wisdom are based a great deal on folks like Machiavelli. And there was a totalitarian. And they think Shakespeare, for all of his literary brilliance, is also politically brilliant and politically instructive.
Well, certainly, but because one of the arguments that many of us make is that not only is he brilliantly politically instructive, but many of his instructions, I believe, are directed at very specific people at court.
I agree.
Through the plays. And therein, I think, lies the biggest key to the Shakespeare authorship question, which is that only a man who was intimately knowledgeable about these people and the lessons he believed they needed to hear could possibly insert those lessons into the works that he knew would be performed in front
of them. Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you entirely. Although I think one of the keys, and I'm working on this as a sidebar, I'm thinking one of the keys to the Shakespeare authorship question is Ben Jonson and Edward de Vere. I want to find those connections, but that's a different discussion for a different day.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yeah.
let's stay on the reservation, please.
Let's stay focused, Wally. Anyway, the Shakespeare's politics. I've got a wonderful book called Shakespeare Between Machiavelli and Hobbes, and these are connections that cannot be denied. You know, the courtier and Machiavelli. Those are huge connections, obviously demonstrable connections in the works, and those kind of things are, of course, meant for other people. But the folks today, or in the last 150, 200 years that have taken them up, are quite obvious. They're quite.
Yeah, I have a question that I really want to ask, but I want to wait until I cover another base first, and that is,
right.
So World War I was known as the war to end kings, the war to end empires, because so many members of royalty went down with World War I. So what I'd be curious about is, so we talked about the Kaiser, but I'd be curious about the other major players in World War I and what connections you found that they have to being influenced by Shakespeare before I ask this crucial question that I want to ask as a theater artist.
The odd thing is, and you will not find this odd, but some of our listeners might. The odd thing is that every single aristocrat ruling person or family, mostly, of course, it's families, of course, especially in Europe, are huge Shakespeare aficionados and readers. Huge. Some of that is because, of course, the aristocrats and rulers, of course, always patronized theaters and saw Shakespeare a great deal. But some of it was certainly instructive. Shakespeare, as you and I both know, was written by a very aristocratic, from a very aristocratic viewpoint. A man devoted to king and country and honor and love of conquest and national fervor. That's a pretty obvious take from anything you read in Shakespeare, especially the histories. And the aristocratic, in the upper crust, I guess you'd say, the ruling party, whether it's the Tsar or the Habsburgs or any of the leaders of anybody from Austro-Croatia to England to Spain, all of those kings and queens and rulers were big fans of Shakespeare, big Shakespeare readers. And
well, it
of
had
course,
to be a
audience
major
members.
part of every classical education of the time, too.
Had to be.
I mean, it was impossible not to be. Just like the Greeks.
It was impossible not to get Latin and Greek and Shakespeare out of a classical education, no matter what country you were in,
Sure.
because you always learned Latin and Greek and Shakespeare, unless there was a country, not in Europe, of course. There's not a country that had not been translating the works for at least 100 years by 1900. So.
Exactly. So you did mention briefly, you said even the Tsar. So
Yes.
what have you found in your research with regards to that? Anything at all?
Very, 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 very tangential, and that's one of those rabbit holes that I cannot go down, Stephen.
Okay.
But there is some evidence at the Royal Court of Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution that Shakespeare was an important part of court.
And the Bolsheviks themselves? What about
the Bolsheviks
them?
themselves, of course, liberated. They were more of a Victor Hugo kind of gang, but yes, they had a great deal of respect for Shakespeare as well.
That's some beautiful highbrow humor right there.
Oh yes, thank you very
More
much.
of a Victor Hugo kind of gang.
Yeah, they were, and as I said, that's the thing. I as you read in my short introductory note still in progress. I can't do a whole lot of translators and translating, except as it appears that Shakespeare was available to this person or that person at this particular time. And that's okay. I mean, I certainly can't go into the details of how good or bad the translations were, although I know there were some horrible German translations for a while, and there were some horrible Italian translations. There was even a point where, Shakespearean actors from England, couldn't even get into Italy for several decades. I'll just say that. But it's fascinating, and that, as you know, it's the trouble with research. It's sort of a never-ending. Wow, that looks cool. What is that about? What is that about? And you go take a tangent, and you got to get back to the road. So it is true that there are the aristocrats of their day, and as you know, Germany in the early 1800s, there was an aristocratic class that spoke French. And there were the peasants who spoke sort of German, Slavic, not very cohesive nation states that spoke various languages. Shakespeare and his followers helped bring that nation together. So
now that leads to the big question I've been wanting to ask.
Now that you prepared me for the question, God help me, what is it?
Here it is.
All right.
Any of these men that we've just mentioned, from the Kaiser to the Tsar to Hitler to Goebbels to Mussolini to the Emperor of Japan, like any of these men that we've mentioned, is there any evidence that you found in your research that any of them were frustrated actors or took to the stage or wished they could take to the stage in any of this?
I don't know. Nothing that suggests that they took to the stage. But I also already told you that Mussolini and Hitler both would characterize themselves as artists.
Sure.
I would think, and
Mussolini as a producer director, obviously.
Yes, and of course, if you want theatrics, all you have to do is look at one of Mussolini's or Hitler's speeches. Certainly, I don't know if they were ever frustrated actors or not. I know that they probably took Hamlet's advice to the players a little bit, except for Hitler, who sawed the air badly.
Sawed the air, yes. every chance he got.
He saw the
He was
air
the
badly,
king
you're
of
right.
sawing the air. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking that they saw in a Shakespeare performance what they wanted to see, which was one of the things was, of course, a beautiful state devoted to its ruler, and also the acting that would make that state possible. I don't know. I cannot tell you for sure that I have ever seen anything that Hitler wanted to be an actor or that Mussolini wanted to get on stage. Of course, Mussolini did help revamp Julius Caesar a great deal. He was intimately involved in that. And both of them promoted Shakespeare, certainly at the start of their reigns. But I would love to find that evidence.
Well, you did. One of the things you mentioned earlier on, you did mention Machiavelli, and I am a firm believer that if you want to understand today's current rulers, read Machiavelli because they all have.
Certainly, they all have. Absolutely, they all have. They've read Machiavelli and The Courtier and Chris Matthews' Hardball, which I recommend to everybody.
The Art of War and
The Art of War is absolutely important. I actually taught political science, and one of my textbooks was Chris Matthews' Hardball. I recommend it to all of your folks. It's got some of the greatest stories about politicians from Churchill to Reagan to Jimmy Carter and everybody in between, Lyndon Johnson, and it has the rules of politics. I told my students we're going to go over the civics lesson and how this came to be, all this American government. But I want you to be able to understand that to get what you want out of a political system, you have to know how it works and you have to know the rules. And the rules are found in Chris Matthews' book.
Yeah, in order to understand these rulers of the modern world, you have to understand what has shaped their mindset. And I would argue that in World War I, World War II, to know that these players had such an affinity to Shakespeare and were so influenced by Shakespeare would help you to interact with those players to navigate the political landscape of the time.
It would, and the modern day equivalent is, you can walk up to anybody in D.C. in the Capitol and say, it's not who you know. And they can answer you the other half of that. It's who you get to know.
Sure.
That's a political rule. And you could have done the same thing with Machiavelli in any of these centers of power, and of any of them.
And so what I'm leading to, a fellow theater man, what I'm leading to is Machiavelli, not only a statesman, but also a playwright.
Oh, yes.
And many people don't know that and aren't aware of that. And I wonder how many of these political players throughout history and in modern times that we've just talked about are familiar with the fact that Machiavelli was a playwright. In fact, one of his most popular plays, he didn't write a very lot of them and not many of them were very good.
Right.
But one of his most popular plays is a play called The Mandrake.
Right.
Which I have actually produced.
Oh, you have?
I have indeed.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Oh, I would have loved to have seen that.
It's a great farce. It really is. And it is so full of commedia.
Yeah.
At its basis. And just stupid funny in many of the stock character ways.
Yeah.
But so the key there being is, here was this guy who has fashioned the mindsets of so many leaders and rulers throughout history, who himself was a, frustrated artist.
Right. And that's a great deal. I mean, my goodness, what did we just see in the Avengers? What's Thanos? A frustrated artist.
Well, that's a great example.
It's a scary one. But yes, I'm up on my pop culture, so thank you very much. Anyway,
yes, well,
it is
chicken or the egg, my friend, chicken or the egg.
Chicken and the egg. That's right. And the I think everybody present company, excepted you and me, who does not do art or has not done a lot of art, I think they're all frustrated actors. I think they're all frustrated artists. I think they'd love to be able to paint or to walk on stage and hold an audience's attention or to write something that somebody else will say in a character that they made up. That is a huge feeling of power for those who have never experienced that. That is a huge, I guess they're jealous too. I guess it's a little bit of jealousy and a little bit of frustration.
There is that, and I think it. I don't know. I think the jealousy, if you want to fashion it, is that maybe that's a harsh word, but I think it comes from the ability that they see in artists to overcome fear.
Yep.
Because so many studies have been done that after death, the thing that scares most people the worst is having to get up in front of a group of people and speak.
Correct. And the funny thing is, for that, I know so many actors who would never get up and say a speech in public as themselves.
Sure.
They're terrified.
The fourth wall is a real thing.
My fantastic wife, Maria, she'll get up on stage and do anything. She's a brilliant actress. But if she's got to sing as herself, maybe in choir or make a speech in public as herself, yipes.
The fourth wall is a very real and tangible thing, and it does create a wonderful security blanket for performers to hide behind the character, as it were.
I agree, and you know that politicians do that too. I mean, politicians, pastors, anybody who gets up in public regularly has got to develop a sense of performance that does not usually entail shaking of the knees and dry mouth. And that's what happens. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just continuing along that strain of thought. So you haven't found anything that said that any of these men wanted to be actors. But when I mentioned Lincoln earlier, and there are a number of accounts, especially his Secretary of State. I think it was Seward.
Yes,
ironically.
That's right.
Ironically, Seward, and then in Macbeth there's a Seward.
There's a Seward.
And Macbeth was one of Lincoln's favorite plays.
He was.
But several cabinet members, including Seward, who wrote accounts of Lincoln reciting scenes or monologues from Shakespeare. Nothing in your research that any of these others would just break into a Shakespearean monologue or tend to quote Shakespeare often, anything like that?
Goebbels did.
Goebbels quoted
Shakespeare quite a bit. But I know, and more's the pity. I can't find anything on Hitler quoting Shakespeare, or of course I haven't gone through every one of Hitler's speeches, and some of them are not translated yet, and my German is not perfect. But that would be a fascinating thing to see if Hitler and Shakespeare. In his quoted Shakespeare in his speeches. That would be wonderful. I imagine Mussolini did, but then again, I have a pretty great imagination, so I'm not sure. That would be fun. That would be fun.
You have to keep your artist's imagination out of this book, though, right? That you're writing.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. If I do too much of it, I'll spend the next 6 weeks just reading Hitler's and Mussolini's speeches, looking for Shakespeare. Although I think I can probably find that with a decent search engine.
Probably.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more. Tell us a little bit more about the book and where you're at with it, and what that process has been.
The process has been not as difficult as you would imagine, since my wife is now full-time permanently at home. But I am her manservant, so that means I have a little bit less time because I cook and clean. Welcome
to my life,
about
brother.
It is, though, she can sit over there in the living room at her office, and I can sit here in the library, and I can read and I can write, and it is interesting. I believe I organized the chapters, and I'm writing chapter as I see something that I want to write about, and then I'm going to reorganize it, obviously, when it gets around to that. World War I is a separate topic, but the problem is, of course, the concept of nationalism, the concept of honor, the concept of hero worship, the concept of heroism. All of those things deserve their own chapters, as does Germany before 1871, and Germany up to 1914, and Germany in the Third Reich. All of those deserve, their own chapters. And so I'll write something about Germany in the after 1933 or 1928, and then I'll write something about Italy up to 1900 or 1850, and therein lies the problem. I'm not sure how I'm going to put all this together. I think maybe I'm going to have to say, okay, I'd love to do a historical timeline. That would be really great. But there's not a whole lot in Japan before 1860, There's just not. And Japan also deserves its own chapter because they have a way of looking at Shakespeare that is very different from Italy and Germany in many, many ways.
They have a way of looking at the world that is completely different from everyone in many, many ways. And to this day, they're still one of the most homogenous cultures in all of the world.
And they are just, and having been there, they're some of the most welcoming people I have ever met in my life. They are wonderful as a populace. But you could say the same thing about Italy and Germany too now, and how they got bamboozled is, anyway, I don't get it. But anyway, they have a great way of looking at the world, and that's another chapter, isn't it? How did Germany and Italy and Japan look at the world in 1870 versus Italy, Germany, and Japan look at the world in 1935? That's something that needs to be done too.
Well, a reduced GDP, poverty, starvation, an economic system that has been devastated to the point of destruction.
Oh, Germany was in total despair.
That puts people in a place where they're willing to accept just about anything that's force-fed to them, i.e., I don't know, maybe like right now.
Yes. And listen, the thing that brought them together, I can quote you Stefan George's final poem, actually, just a little bit of it, if that's okay with you. But in a mournful age, it is the poet who keeps the marrow sound, the germ alive. He who stirs the holy flame that leaps across and shapes the flesh in which to burn, discovers the truth of tidings which our fathers gave, that those elected to the highest goal begin by passing through the waste, that once the heart of Europe shall redeem the earth, and when the final hope is almost perished, in sternest grief, his eyes already see a coming light.
Would you send that to me? I'd like to have.
Of course, I would.
I'd like to have that.
Of course, I would. And I'm telling you,
profound.
No Hamlet, Stephen. It's just an awesome book. It's just an awesome book. This is, I have been sent by Torch and Steel and George, who was not a Hitler fan, especially when he saw his Jewish friends, what they were going through. But there was about half of his circle went Nazi, full Nazi, and the other half did not. And that's another chapter in the book too. No, it's not. I can't do that. Be a 7,000-page book, and I don't want that.
How many chapters? 1,800 chapters.
I don't know. Well, it could be an appendix, I guess, or an article maybe. Although I got to write 7 of those still now too. So
you might be on the verge of a series of books here, my friend.
I hope so. This is fascinating, though. This is just and the more you learn, the more you want to learn. Of course, isn't that the point of scholarship, though?
Well, you must be familiar. I'm sure you. I know you are. I'm not even going to ask. I'm just going to say, Gary Wills wrote a magnificent book called John Wayne's America. Have you read it?
No, I've not read it, but I know about it.
You need to read it. I think it falls along the lines of this book that you're writing, because it's truly all about how John Wayne influenced American politics and culture in such a way that led to some of the outcomes we all experienced in the world, not just in America, but in the world.
Oh, I don't doubt that for a second.
And he explains very specifically in the book, you know, some of the interesting aspects of Marion Morrison, the real John Wayne, how he became John Wayne, and how that persona that he developed shaped the mindsets, the egos, the personalities, the personal politics of some of America's most famous leaders, including folks like Ronald Reagan,
Of course.
Newt Gingrich,
Yep.
and others that he mentions in the book. And it's incredible when you think about how things played out historically, when you hear stories about Newt Gingrich being dressed as the Duke as a young child.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Right. And so then later, you know, here's a young boy in his earliest, most impressionable years who wants to be that dashing hero cowboy who then grows up to become Speaker of the House, and that plays out.
Of course.
Ronald Reagan is another one, and he goes on. Kissinger is a big one. Kissinger was a giant John Wayne fan, and his whole personality was shaped by his adoration of John Wayne and John Wayne films.
Who'd have thunk it?
Yeah, and then of course Gary Wills talks about, you know, the irony being that John Wayne never served in the military. John Wayne was never a politician. John Wayne actually hated horses. You know, he was much happier on the deck of a boat than anywhere else.
Correct.
He wore a 3-piece suit just about anywhere he went. You know, so he points out those kinds of things as well. It's a fascinating book, and I think that you ought to read it.
I will definitely read it. That's of course, as Mark Anderson once told me, influence is not causation. So I'm not gonna find Shakespeare guilty of causing all these things, but certainly the influence is there. I mean, if those guys had wanted a real hero who was an actor, I would have said Jimmy Stewart, who did serve, who did, you know, fly a number of missions over Germany, et cetera, pilot planes and all that other stuff.
Amen to that.
But I did not know Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, that is
There's
that's
an
amazing.
audio recording of the book that Gary Wills himself narrates that you can find, and it's a fascinating listen as well. You know, because
that's
few
great.
people can read someone's book better than the person who wrote it.
Barbara Rosenblatt is one of those people, but I agree with you generally. That's true.
Yeah, so you can find the audio recording of Gary Wills' John Wayne's America. One of the things I remember specifically about the book is, and this is a trivia question now, and this would be interesting in today's day and age of tearing down statues, but do you know which individual has more full-size, life-size, or larger than life-size bronze statues of him in America than any other human being?
Wow, that's got to be John Wayne.
It is John Wayne.
Wow.
Yeah. Isn't that, what does that say, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that is fascinating.
It is.
Now, I would not have guessed John Wayne before we had this conversation at all. I would have guessed George Washington.
Of course not. Of course not. But it happens to be John Wayne. Gary Wills points that out in the book. And then he, you know, goes into details about why he believes that to be so, and et cetera. But, you know, it just made me think about with this book that you're writing. And again, you're right. Influence is not causation. And causation oftentimes is a result of circumstance.
Correct.
That influence can never dictate or predetermine.
Correct.
But influence can definitely have an impact on reaction to causation.
And that's why I added the term appropriation to the title, because people see something and they appropriate it to their own ends. And that is absolutely a fact in this particular case.
Well, and go figure that Goebbels and Hitler were the kings of cultural appropriation by trying to steal Shakespeare.
Yep. Absolutely. But so were the German intelligentsia in 1914. And
Today we have people condemning white folk for wearing dreadlocks.
Correct.
But imagine in 1940s.
Yes.
When Germans were trying to steal Shakespeare as their native son.
Oh yeah, and I imagine they honked off a bunch of Englishmen by doing that. Shakespeare, by the way, performances rose during World War II. Performances of Shakespeare definitely rose.
What about Churchill? We haven't touched on Churchill. Anything about him and how he felt about Shakespeare?
I haven't seen anything yet, but I have not done a whole. Shakespeare is one of my favorite people. He is one of my favorite Englishmen. He and Shakespeare and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, after whom my alma mater is named, are the three most admired Englishwomen too. Princess Diana was fourth, evidently, in the last one. So Churchill. He would certainly have been educated in Shakespeare. I don't know if he would, and he did go to theater, I know that. He did attend theater regularly. I don't remember anything about him and Shakespeare. But now I'm going to go look it
Roosevelt?
up. Thank you so much, Steve.
What about Roosevelt?
Roosevelt was a huge Shakespeare fan.
Yeah, I can imagine. He must have been.
Oh, he was. It's not quite the thing, but we have nothing to fear but fear itself is fairly close to a number of Shakespeare quotes, as you know, including Macbeth.
Yes.
So it's I'm sure he was. And I know he was a regular theater person. The problem with Roosevelt, of course, certainly after the mid 1930s, is his disability. Precluded him doing a whole bunch of non-political things because he took 2 or 3 hours to get into his outfit with installed crutches and all of those things just in order to go somewhere. And
well, he wasn't going to go sit in a theater for a couple of hours.
Correct.
With his in a wheelchair or with his infirmity.
That's right, or having to stand, or it took a couple people to help him sit when he was in those outfits that enabled him to stand up and give a speech. It was very, very tough on him. But yeah,
and anything about Truman? Any research into Truman and how he felt about the Bard?
I don't know about Harry. I've not seen anything about Truman. I'm starting on the dictators first, and then I'm going to the presidents and the prime ministers next.
Okay. Okay.
I do know Roosevelt, and I have a sneaking suspicion about Churchill because I'm sure he went through the English school system, and so he would have gotten a heavy dose of Shakespeare. And I'm not sure he liked him, or if he didn't, but I'm pretty sure he did. It certainly is an influence on his oratory. He was a brilliant orator and spoke to the masses a great deal. The difference between wholesale and retail that we talk about in politics. If you're a wholesale politician, you're a Ronald Reagan, you're a Winston Churchill. You can reach every single person by just tuning on the radio or the TV. And Roosevelt too. If you're a retail politician, you're Lyndon Johnson. Several stories about Lyndon Johnson. One-on-one, he could convince you to vote against your own bill in Congress. Hitler was wholesale. Mussolini was wholesale. Certainly the emperor was wholesale. He communicated that way to the mass of people. And the mass of people could believe that he was talking to them personally.
Well, he had the easiest role when you think about it, truthfully.
Oh yeah.
I'm the emperor. I am ordained by the heavens and a long line of family history. You
Correct.
must, and in our feudal system, you must kneel to me. He had
Correct.
it the easiest. Actually, Mussolini and Hitler had it real tough compared to the emperor of Japan.
They did, but they were fierce orators. They were fierce nationalists. And they were dealing with countries who were desperate for those things. desperate for new leadership, desperate to get out of the Depression, desperate to get out of financial hardship, desperate to be proud of themselves again.
That's
And
interesting. That's
the
a
difference.
very interesting comparison to the times we're living in right now,
I
where what we
agree.
see is a lot of negativity about being American and negativity about America. We're definitely dealing with some horrible financial times, and
Yep.
and it's interesting how in those times, historically, they have opened the door for a terrible happening to occur.
Yes.
And let's hope that we can learn from history and avoid those pitfalls moving forward in our own history.
I agree. The first step is to stop hating each other just because you have a different opinion.
That is a crucial one when you think about the history of some of the men you just talked about and how
I
they
agree.
used that to their advantage.
They used nationalism and promoted hate.
In a way that Shakespeare never would have condoned.
He would have never condoned that. He would have never condoned that. He understood the divine right of kings, but when kings went bad, you got rid of them. He understood that the kings ruled, but that bad rulers who were full of hate and subterfuge and dishonesty did not deserve to be rulers.
And he propagated the need for courtiers to help curtail some of that. And I think that that's why you have so many aristocratic types who have cleaved to the writings of Shakespeare over the centuries so wholeheartedly.
Yes,
and
has.
I think, again, that touches to our premise that these works that have influenced so many and so many in such high positions of power who understand all of these levels of dynamics, of class, of divine rights of kings, of aristocracy. I think that it's just further proof, and I can't wait to see your book come to fruition, because it will just be another linchpin in answering the age-old question that is now age-old.
Yes, it
who
is.
really is the author? Who really composed these works that were not the causes, as you have pointed out clearly in this program, not the causes of the things that happened, but definitely had a magnificent influence on the things that happened. And my premise, and I know yours is too, is that it certainly could not have been the illiterate, non-writing, non-book owning,
bumpkin from Stratford.
son of a glove maker from Stratford on Avon.
There's just no way. I'm looking at one of my books. It's called Shakespeare's Books by Stuart Gillespie. It's at least 350 pages long. No, more than that. I lied. 487. 497 or more. And these are just encyclopedia entries. Just not more than a couple of pages each of all the books Shakespeare must have known. And I'm looking at people and going,
but he didn't own any of them.
Your BS meter has got to be going off if you think the guy from Stratford owned a book or had access to all of these books. The author had to have access to these books because he gets it right. He gets courtiers right. He gets court right. Hello, McFly.
Well, this has certainly been a fantastic conversation, Wally, and very intriguing, and a completely different style of episode than I think we've had in the history of the program. So I want to thank you for joining us on this episode.
Thank you for having me, Steven. Thank you. I
Absolutely.
appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to getting this thing in some kind of coherent order. I'll probably send you an advance copy and say, just go ahead and bleed all over it with your red flare pen, buddy.
I'm sure I will do that.
I'm sure you will too.
But also, we'll have you back for another episode to discuss the launch of the thing once it's ready and let people know how to get it and where to buy it. And between now and then, we'll invite all of our listeners to give us a rate or a review wherever you're streaming this podcast from. And please visit our swag shop. If you go to dragonwagonradio.com, you can get yourself some Quiller swag. I've got some t-shirts, a coffee mug, a few other items that always raise an eyebrow and a question wherever I go. So please, if you want to help promote the program, you want to share it with others, you want to get a great conversation started like the one we just had with our friend Wally Hurst, go to the swag shop, pick up a t-shirt or a coffee mug, and spread the word, won't you? We really would appreciate it. In the meantime, we'll remind everyone, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.